Hi, this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. In today's video I'm going to talk about the Dendrobium nobile type hybrids and the varying care through the seasons. The main reason being to get them to bloom nicely at their appropriate time. Otherwise you just end up with a green plant. Okay, before we talk about the hybrids, we'll have a chat about the species itself. Dendrobium nobile is the species. There are various named varieties like Cooksonianum. A variety is a consistent variable that is found in various places and will breed true. So these are still the species, but they have differences, and those differences can be found in many places consistently, so they can have an appropriate name. But the species, where does it come from then? Starting in northern India, foothills of the Himalayas, right round through to southern China, so through Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and some of the islands. So that region of the world. It's very widespread, it's found in many places. It has been reported, it's even used in Chinese medicine. I wouldn't recommend eating the thing. But naturally it's an epiphyte, although it is found relatively frequently growing on mossy rocky outcrops and things like that, so it's not a true epiphyte only, it can be found as a lithophyte as well. It can grow into quite a large spreading plant and at various elevations, so it's relatively temperature tolerant. Anything from a couple of 100 metres up to sort of 2,000 metres, so you know that's quite a temperature range really. Mainly from open evergreen forests through to semi-deciduous forests, and in some cases in deciduous forests. That has a major effect on lighting through the seasons. Right, if you have a look at, I've got a picture of the species sort of growing wild. If you have a look at this, you can see it's a very spreading plant. The blooms occur near the top of the canes from about halfway up, maybe 2/3 of the way up. It's quite vigorous in its natural environment, and the canes start off a green colour with their leaves on, and then the leaves will eventually drop, normally during the second season, sometimes at the end of the first growing season, sometimes not until the end of the second growing season, but it will eventually be, the canes will be deciduous. And the deciduous canes change colour. They go from a nice bright green to a more yellowy green. They get paler as they age, and the really old canes end up getting quite shriveled. But nonetheless they're held on the plant. They're rarely lost. So right, if we have a closer look at the blooms, these have traits, and we'll keep hold of those in our mind as we move on to the hybrids. The main traits to take away in your mind from these blooms are that they are pale in the centre, and they gradate to a darker colour on the tips of the petals, the sepals, and even the lip. The lip itself has a dark centre. Yeah? Not going into the colours at the moment, it's just where the colours are and where those differences are. So that's what the species looks like. Let's have a look at a hybrid, and then we'll go over the care as such. This is a nobile hybrid. You would probably have difficulty ever getting hold of this because it's an old hybrid. Most of the Dendrobium hybrids you will find on the market are mass produced. Many of them have originated in Thailand or Taiwan, over in that area. They're very good at producing multiple colours and varieties. These have a traditional blooming season, but in the mass-produced nurseries they can be forced into bloom at any time of the year. So you can find these for sale most of the year round. Now I'm going to switch to Northern Hemisphere now and stick to it, so remember that. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere you might need to turn things back to front. But I'm not going to talk about actual months, I'm going to talk about seasons, so it should still work. Trust me. Right, so if we have a quick look at these blooms, remember those traits? So what have we got then? Okay, these blooms are mainly yellow, but they have another colour on the tips of the petals and sepals and on the tip of the lip. And the centre of the lip is darker. It's maintained those traits. Yeah, so that is a hybrid. This one's called Dendrobium prima donna, and as I said, it's an old cross, so chances are you won't find this one anymore. Now, although it's a hybrid, it will have the traits of the species. So again, it would be a spreading plant with age, with all the canes coming from a central base and spreading out away from that base. Often the older canes tend to be in the centre and the newer canes tend to come up round the outside. So from appearances point of view, you can end up with a plant that's green all round the outside and has gone deciduous down through the centre, and it's just got, you know, leafless canes down the centre. Right, difference in the canes then. This is an older cane here. These are places where it has bloomed before. That could still bloom again. These are capable of blooming from about halfway up to the top of the cane, and they won't necessarily produce blooms over that length of the cane in a season. They might spread over 2 seasons. Yeah? So even though a cane has bloomed, possibly for the first time for you, doesn't mean to say it won't bloom in other places. The blooms come out from the nodes opposite the leaves, mainly on deciduous canes. In other words, this is a new cane, this is last year's growth, yeah? Still fully leaved, not blooming. This is destined to bloom next spring, late winter into spring. In other words, this time of year. So first year growth, following year blooms. And possibly some other blooms mid-season or again the following year. So that's the general pattern. Right. We have, last time I looked, 4 seasons, which we need to consider. Now, where the species come from, there are not really 4 pronounced seasons like I would get here on the south coast of the UK and others in similar latitudes or longitudes. My teeth won't work. But basically their seasons are consisting of a growing season, we'll call it summer, and a resting season, we'll call it winter, where conditions are not suitable for growth. But in between those 2 seasons there is a transition which you could call spring and autumn, spring and fall, but they're much, much shorter. They're not anywhere near as pronounced as the 4 seasons I've got to put up with. Right, so I'm going to start talking about the care in the summer season. We're going to call that the growing season. As the day lengths increase and the temperatures rise, the plant comes into growth and begins nice bright new green canes from the base of the plant. I put an S on the end because with any luck we do get more than one. On a large mature plant you could get a lot. So we get our canes starting to grow. They've got to get to their full size in that growing season, because at the end of that growing season they will stop and they won't continue growing ever again. So you've got to do your best to grow those as best you can. They don't need bright intense light to grow, and there's a trick here, but they do need constant access to food and water. So my expression that I use is, in the growing season, feed and water well. Yeah? Make sure they get some nutrients suitable for growth and push them on as hard as you can. As that season comes to an end, we move into autumn/fall. The plant will naturally respond to the shorter day lengths. As those day lengths start to shorten, the plant will come to the end of its growth. On these canes, the new ones, they will form a terminal leaf when they finish growing. It normally points upright, or more upright than the ones that stick out sideways, and it's often smaller. And there will not be any more leaves on that cane. That's it, it's done. Although it may continue swelling up for a while. Yeah? So as we get to the end of the growing season, the plant naturally starts to slow down with the changing in the day lengths. You need to respond in a similar manner, because the species in the wild at this point would be transitioning from the wet summer season into the much drier winter season. That transition is in the plant. So it will finish its canes, it will finish growing, and it will go in to what's called the rest period. Now, with the hybrids, getting this right is not as important as it would be if you owned the species. But the closest you can get to these transitions and this care, the better blooming you will get. And that can be anything from no blooms at all to an absolute mass blooming, depending on how close to these conditions the plant needs and you can provide. So, plant slowing down going into autumn/fall. Reduce the level of feed on a gradual basis and the amount of water. Now, when I say the amount of water, what I really mean is the frequency, yeah, at this point. Yeah, so you're not really reducing the amount you give it, you're just not giving it that amount as often. So allow it to dry more in between. And that's it, that is that autumn care. But as we go into the rest period proper, which is winter, you've got shorter day lengths, that's not ideal, and you've got cooler temperatures, that's brilliant. What this plant needs for its rest period is the brightest light you can give it, and it needs to cool down from the temperatures it was grown in. So if you were growing this with average temperatures, say 20 to 25 degrees C, then you need to, if you can, knock 10 degrees off of that and take that down to 10 to 15. That will be brilliant. If you can't do that, get it as cool as you can. Find a bright windowsill in a room with no heating if you've got one. That's about as good as you can get if you were growing in the home. So cool them down and increase the light. You can fool them with the light by growing them through the growing season in relatively low light. Not so low that they don't grow very well, but a relatively low light, so that when you get to their winter rest, you can put them in a much brighter position. Yeah? So you've tricked the plant into thinking it's much brighter in that winter season. As I say, we do have a problem with the short days, so even if you can find a nice bright position, it's not bright for long enough really. So we do the best we can. Then what will happen? Well, as you go through winter, you'll notice some very slight changes on the canes that have lost their leaves and haven't bloomed yet. And you will start seeing little nubbins coming out opposite where the leaves used to be. Yeah? Those are the start of the blooms. Yeah? But they're not really. They're the start of spikes. Yeah? And on a nobile hybrid, the spikes can have anything from 1 to 3 or 4 blooms. But those nubbins will sit there for a while. For goodness sake, don't start feeding and watering, because remember, through this winter period it's almost dry. As you reduce that feed and water in the fall, when you get into true winter and it's having its cool, bright rest, you don't feed them at all, and you only give them enough water to stop them shriveling. You just got to keep your eye on them, and that's a judgment call. There's no way anybody can tell you how frequently you need to add water and how much. But if the canes are starting to shrivel in, then give them a drop of water, not feed. Yeah? So when you see these nubbins, you know the plant is thinking about blooming. Don't feed and water yet. Eventually those nubbins will start to move away, and if there's going to be more than one bloom, they will start to split and show signs of how many blooms there will be, and on the ends of the spike you will see buds starting to form. Now's the time to start increasing your water. Not stand it in a bucket for a week, gently, bit at a time, bit more frequently, gradually increase the watering, and after a relatively short while, a few weeks of that, you'll see the buds starting to swell. The plant is now growing. It's not growing new growths necessarily, but it's growing something, and to do that it uses resources. So now's the time to start introducing a bit of feed, but don't go mad. If you didn't feed it, the chances are it would still extend those buds and still bloom. But if you hadn't given it some food and helped that process, it probably will have drained the plant of its resources and left it relatively weak. Yeah? During this time, at some point, the plant should come back into growth, and you'll get the new canes coming from the base. And we've gone full circle, because once those new growths start at the base, you're going into the growing season. Feed and water well. That's the circle of life for the nobile type hybrids. Get as close as you can. The new canes will produce new roots, anything from at the same time as they start growing to when the canes are halfway up, and on some of those hybrids you don't get new roots until the canes are almost full size. But get to know your plant, because when new roots start to grow is an ideal time to repot if you need to. Don't repot just because there's new roots growing. Repot because you need to. Main reason with nobile hybrids that you need to is it's growing out of the pot. In other words, they are a spreading plant at the base, and they've reached the edge of the pot, and those nice new roots are going down the outside. Not so good. Better if they get in some media. As far as media is concerned, they need air around the roots. They are naturally an epiphyte, although, as I said, they can be found on, this is just back to the species again, you won't find one of these in the wild. This doesn't exist. But a relatively airy media, but not so airy that the roots dry far too fast. In that growing season, constant access to moisture and nutrients. Yeah, that will be difficult to do if you've got a large airy, for instance, like chunky bark. It'll be difficult to supply those conditions with that type of media. Medium and small bark mixed I find very good for nobile hybrids. This is basically what this plant is in. It's got some grow stones mixed in with it, but I can't get them anymore, so that's not going to happen very often. And it's got a reasonable pot full of roots. Currently the roots are not in active growth. Currently, I have no new growths at the base, but I have had to start feeding and watering this to aid the blooms opening. So it's now on a low volume feed with some water at a low frequency. It's ticking over. As the day lengths increase, the new growths will start, and then we can go again, as they say. So there we go. Colours vary from almost pure white out into the pinks, into purples and even reds. Going in the other direction, you can start from white and go through various shades of cream on into the yellows, and I've even seen some with oranges on them. So the colours are almost endless. Of the natural colours that orchids can occur, you can find nobile hybrids with those colours on. And they can vary. I was going to say, I've got one in flower at the moment that's quite deep purple and pink, and it's got a deep red centre, and it's got yellow on the lip. So it has virtually all the colours that are possible to have on one bloom. Plant size, this I would class as a medium sized plant. Over in the corner there I've got another nobile that is twice as tall as this. They can grow large. And remember, when you buy it, the chances are it's had growth restrictors added to keep the size compact, and that growth restrictor chemical that the trade use also has a lovely knock-on effect because it bursts them into bloom. Yeah? When you buy one of these and it's got blooms from the top of the cane almost down to the bottom, you'll be lucky if you will ever achieve that again. But if you can get blooms from halfway up to the top of the cane, you've done well. So yeah, a chat about nobile type hybrids. They are rewarding, and providing you can do that cool down in the winter to a degree, 1 degree or another, you'll probably be successful. Don't drown them when they're not growing. That's a bottom line for virtually all orchids. If an orchid is not in active growth, what's it going to do with water and feed? I'll tell you what it'll do with it. It'll decide to rot its roots. So don't water them in their rest season to any extent more than just getting rid of that possible shrivelling. I've gone 5 or 6 weeks with a nobile type hybrid in the winter with no water at all, and I stopped feeding around mid-November to the end of November. I'll have started reducing the watering prior to that, but the feed gets chopped mid-November to the end of November-ish. Depends on the plant. If the plant's still finishing off growing those canes, I'm not going to stop feeding. That would stunt those canes. If they want to grow, let them grow and help them. If that means you start your drier, brighter winter rest a bit later, so be it. Run with the plant, not the dates on the calendar. Look at your plant and respond to what your plant would like. Okay, that's Dendrobium nobile types. Within the hybridization program, other suitable, compatible types of dendrobiums get added into the mix sometimes, and that can alter the cultural requirements. Many of them are not named and they're not registered. So you end up with a nobile hybrid that's got bits of other types of dendrobiums in it and you don't know what they are. So sometimes they will behave differently to that culture guide I've just given you. Sometimes you will get growths popping up at different times of the year, so it's always in growth, and you sort of think, well, how am I supposed to rest this then? Well, chances are you won't be able to. You'll just be able to respond to the lower day lengths. You just have to wing it, basically. It's no determined thing. If you can't find out what's in it, I mean, I've known dendrobiums that have been added into the hybridization program that are warm to hot growers. well, that's going to have an effect on the plant. And it might be that although it responds quite like a nobile type hybrid, and you put it into its winter rest and cool it right down, you might have cooled it down beyond what it can now cope with, and you could lose it because it's too cold for that one with that mix. So you do get some unusual behaviour in amongst them sometimes. They can bloom more than one time a year, as well as a consequence of some things that might have been added in. Anyway, there we go. They're very rewarding. They're upright growing in the main, although they do have a slight spreading habit. They do well in a pot. You might have to stake them because the canes are so tall. They're also capable of getting very top heavy, especially when in bloom with large blooms. You'd have to take that on board. They can be mounted, grow mounted, and they will hang out from the mount like as though they were growing on a tree trunk. Yeah, that's a natural way. But keeping them hydrated and fed through the growing season is not as easy on a mount as it is in a pot. There we go, that'll do. So a ramble on about nobile type hybrids and how the care changes with the seasons. And remember that the true species will need that seasonal care, or the chances are you will get very few or no blooms at all. But we were talking about the hybrids. If you can't give them that seasonal care, the chances are they might bloom anyway, because the hybridization programs are breeding those awkward traits out, leaving a more reliable blooming orchid for you to grow in your home or wherever. See you next time. Thanks for dropping by.